All right. 2 people watching. Great. Okay, let's see. Going to... I need a document. Where is that document? Let me bring that up. Okay, cool. 4 people watching. Typing spring 2021. Ha! Three people watching. Okay. I'll give it a minute or 2 before we get going for reals. But hi everybody. Welcome to class. Welcome on this snowy day. The nice thing about online teaching is that we can get this lecture in and then you don't need to worry about making it up, which is wonderful. So I see we have 5 people watching. That's great. So again, thank you for coming on the snow day. And I thought before we get into it, I thought we have a few things on our, I don't know what you want to call it, on our schedule here to talk about. But first things first, I gave you all a piece of homework last week during our presentation day. So I wanted to take a few minutes to discuss that homework, which, if you recall, was to watch one of those just creative competition shows, like a Great British Bake Off or a Blown Away, or I can't remember what's the Forged in some, whatever the one is where they work with metal, Chopped, Project Runway, any of those. If you watched one of those, I let's take a few minutes to talk about it. And I did the homework too. My wife and I binged the rest of the season of Blown Away that we were on. Forge and Fire, yeah, that one. And it was interesting too because so I come from, my background, I mean, you've heard this before, my background's in architecture, and this was very much like what school was to me. And in fact, a bunch of people that I know, when I was getting out of school, that's when Project Runway was really, really popular. And I remember this buddy of mine was like, have you watched Project Runway? It's amazing. And, he is not the type of person that would be into a show about fashion, right? And I'm like, dude, you watch Project Runway? He's like, it's like Studio, but a TV show. And I'm like, oh, I guess you're right. Guys Grocery Game, nailed it. Okay. I don't know, but maybe I've heard about it. I always watch a lot of Chopped. Nice. So, and I thought about Iron Chef could be one, but Iron Chef is a little different, and I'll explain why. Not that anybody said that they're watching Iron Chef. I just it popped into my head, and I was like, oh wait, but Iron Chef has different things. So yeah, he was saying it was kind of like our studio class, which was your build your architecture model and then present it in front of people class, and so it's this kind of it's these shows are like art school but in miniature, and they drive my wife crazy because she is from a field that doesn't have as much subjectivity in it, and in art school that is always the tough part, is that sometimes you'll just get somebody watching your presentation and it's just not their thing, and like it always is sort of based on this subjectivity, which can be very tough to deal with. So like watching especially this glass blowing show where it's really based on art and there is not totally a set of like definite judging criteria, can be very different. But I guess like, so just a question to the chat. You know, I gave you some stuff to look at or think about as you were watching them. And, you know, the different shows might have like differing levels of them based on what they are. But like, what are some things that like struck you about, I guess, what they're asked to do versus what they're judged on? Maybe what... you know, like I said, did you find any subjectivity in the judging? Well, I like this, I don't like that. You know, what are some of your thoughts, like kind of freewheeling, and then we'll see where the discussion goes on it. And I'm going to look up Nailed It, because I don't know that one. Oh, okay, Nailed It. Complicated Cakes and Confectioner. Oh, okay, interesting. Another one would be, what's the one with Amy Poehler? Making It. That's another good one. Nailed It is a bunch of amateur bakers trying to make master level desserts as well as possible. Okay, a little bit like Great British Bake Off. Which, like, they say they're amateurs, and that's technically true, but some of the stuff that they do is ridiculous. There's some food science on that show. Okay, so, like, what are some of the things that you observed about these shows? See, I don't want to start because I'll like give away all the stuff I wanted to talk about. In Chopped and Guys Grocery Games, I see judges kind of disagree about what they like. Okay, so that's a really great... so I see judges kind of disagree about what they like or what they don't like about a dish. So that's number one. So that's a really good point. I really like that point because... Let's talk about the format of feedback in this kind of environment. So, like, you know, one thing, what we are doing when we have you stream your games like we streamed last week, and keep answers coming while I'm talking. I'm responding to the one, but I'll go right into the next one. So keep them coming. One of the things that I really... I mean, I'll just give it away. I think all game school should be architecture school, and that is totally my own bias, but it's art and architecture school has a really good format for games, because when you work in games, especially as an indie developer, but also even when you are doing it like at a booth in a studio, you know, it's a lot like that kind of school. It's a lot like that kind of education. And the thing that, you know, I guess the exception is if you are working at a big studio and you have a booth, your booth is probably populated by the marketing people and not by you, the developer. So, you know, that there's a disconnect there. But when you are making a game and you're standing at a booth, at your own booth, it's kind of like being in art school. the format is slightly different because it's not so formal. Like people game players and fans are coming up to your booth, trying it out, like maybe taking a thing that tells you them where to get it on Steam or whatever. But the idea is the same, is that you are getting up in front of a group of people and you're saying, here is this thing I designed, here's this thing that I created, here are the elements of the created thing, and here's what I was thinking when I was putting it together. And then usually the evaluator, now in our case it might be I'm at a booth showing my game off, so your evaluator is essentially also your customer. But if you're doing this in an art or design context, it might be like, an evaluator. Like, imagine a different version would be if you were graphic designers competing for a contract, or architects, or, on the case of these shows, it might be you're talking to the judges about your process of the thing so that you can, get the $1 million and the residency at the Corning Glass Museum or whatever. And what you're doing is you're doing a defense, basically. And there's always going to be people that agree with you, and there's going to be people that disagree with you. And it's not that they are judging you and calling you a bad person. It's that there is this sort of like back and forth that starts to happen in art that, a lot of people think criticism is a negative word. And that's in games, it's especially prevalent when you get into like games criticism is usually taken to mean that you're giving it like too much water, 7 out of 10, right? A bad review score. When in fact, criticism is what in the art world would be like part of what we call appreciation, where it is dialogue about the artwork. So it might be like, saying these elements don't work, these elements do work. And it's not that they're saying like, well, the painter should just change it. It's, you analyze and you learn. And sometimes, you're analyzing a painting or something that came from a period where the artist was going through a thing or developing still or something. But it becomes this like signifier. That's what these are. It's not that you're necessarily saying it's good or bad. No, you can think it's good or bad. And to what the first point was, that's what's important actually. Because if you spark conversation, and again, judges kind of disagree about what they like and don't like about a dish, you've won. and let me put this for you in like blank student terms. When I was a student and the jurors, because we'd always have like at the end of the semester a thing called jury, not like literal jury duty, but a architecture jury would be I'm getting up and presenting my work. In the real world, it's called jury because you're competing over like a contract or something. In this, they just called it jury. So imagine, like you basically just had jury last week for this, style of teaching, for this style of project. And, when I was a student and I gave my spiel and my presentation, I knew that I was done when the jurists were talking and I didn't have to say anything. I was like, it's Christmas break now. I got them going. That you've won. If you spark conversation, that's the best thing you can do. Even if somebody is, your job is not to get universal praise. Your job is to get people talking. So that's number one. So that's awesome. How they judged decorations was subjective. Taste was less subjective. So that's really interesting. And it's interesting about the food ones versus like the art ones. Because the food ones, and I haven't watched Nailed It, but I've watched tons of Great British Bake Off. Like, there's objective parts where, and it's tough because it's always Paul and Prue/Mary. But like, every time a contestant on Great British Bake Off says, I'm putting matcha in it. And if you're not familiar with matcha, it's like kind of extreme green tea. I like matcha. Not everybody likes. If you have bad matcha, it just tastes like you're drinking like grass, like lawn clippings. But good matcha can be really tasty. But like anytime somebody puts matcha in it, you're like, they're gonna go down. They're going down. Except the times where like, half of the people in the tent put matcha in. Or same thing with like chili. You're like, oh shoot, they're in trouble. Because like they can't take any heat, the judges. So there's that subjective element. But like, a cake should be a certain level of moistness, right? If you overbake the cake, you overbaked the cake, right? So there are these like subjective, objective things in this. And what I think is really interesting, and to go off the one that I watched, the glass blowing one, that was really interesting because you almost have like two things you're being judged on. And I think this is important for you to remember too. There's two things you're being judged on. There is we'll call it technical, or I guess like I might even liken it to the craft of it, meaning like what is the physical reality of the thing. So in the case of a baked good, it's like, does it have a soggy bottom? Did you overbake it? Did you make puff pastry right? Those things, like, those are technique things. So that's kind of like your did you have like an error while you were showing off or did your game crash, right? That's like, are your graphics... See, I don't like going there because like graphics being nice doesn't mean anything anymore. It's like, is your game competently constructed? Like, did you use Unreal well? Did you use the 3D well? You don't have any like glaring technical errors. And when I say that, keep in mind, I'm not talking about like, are your graphics photorealistic? That's a style. That's not a level of mastery anymore. Style, like it's dictated by like, you could do cartoony 3D or whatever if you want. So, that's like less subjective. That's the craft. But then there's also the subjective parts, which is like the creativity, which is, you use these flavors together and what did that do? I like it. I don't like it. How is your decoration match the topic? How do you express an idea? That's the subjective stuff. And, you'll notice things in different shows, how those are tuned. Some of the show, like Great British Bake Off in particular, will be like, they will always, I feel like they rate technical stuff except in the actual technical challenge every time, but they'll rate the technical a little more heavily in the beginning, and then by the end, they've got people that have mastered the technical skills. Like, you can assume people have their technique down at that point, and then they're getting like less specific challenges and more thought creative based challenges. And I want you to notice that because like this class is very thought creative based challenge. Like you got to do some stuff in an engine, but the idea is, ultimately it's meant to squeeze out your creativity. And so there's those two aspects to it. And what I want you to understand is once you've reached a certain, like right now as students, you're often struggling with the technical, but eventually you're going to get to the point where like, I'm just going to assume the engine and there's no point in rating you on that. So it's like, we then want to start seeing your creativity. Same thing with like, when you're at that booth showing off your game, nobody cares like how well you use the Unreal. I mean, they'll care if it crashes, but that's very different from, everybody gets bugs in their game, but that's very different from like the thing that's going to sell the game isn't the technical skill, it's the creativity. So that's why I wanted to bring this up, because like there is this objective, subjective. But everybody just kind of, I'll tell you right now, the objective is the assumption. It's not the thing that makes you exceptional for most things. I like how the create interest solution to me. I like how they create interesting solutions to make them, as they don't know how the thing they're trying to replicate was made. So, okay, if I'm understanding the right, you like how people came up with interesting solutions to complete the challenges, even if they didn't know the exact way something was put together. That's actually really a good point, because part of these challenges on these shows is like, hey, you've got 4 hours to make this thing, right? In ideal situations, you would not only have 4 hours to make the thing, you'd have many hours to make the thing. But for one reason or another, like, they are putting it under a deadline because it's the pattern of the show, or they're replicating. I think Bake Off is really good at this, because they'll be like, if you're catering a party, sometimes you got to know how to do it in a sweltering tent or something like that, right? So that's really interesting, because part of this, and part of how these are patterned, is that they're putting you in less than ideal situations to see not only your creativity of your ideas, but also you being able to, like, deal with the production reality. So, like, if something doesn't work, like, how can you work around it to make it work, even if you've got to, like, fake it working? And, this is where, the perfect example of this is anytime a developer releases their source code, like last year was the 10th year anniversary of the game VVV, which is an indie game based on, like, gravity. It's an indie platformer, except instead of jumping, you switch gravity. It's a really great game if you've never played it. But, like, the developer released the source code, and everybody was like, this is garbage. And he's like, I launched my game, didn't I? You're not going to make it perfect, but you need to make it, if that makes sense. And that's where an important skill comes around, is like working around design issues. So that's, again, what a class like this and what challenges like that are meant to suss out. I'm going to go through a few more, because we do need to have a lecture. The person with makes less mistakes wins. Find it fun to learn beginner baking mistakes. Yeah, I mean, and again, like, I wouldn't even say it's the person who makes less mistakes. I mean, yeah, if you're going to drop your cake, yeah. But it's almost like, how good are you at hiding the mistake? Or, like, covering the mistake, or working around the mistake, or packaging the mistake. In games we call that, like, bug not feature, or feature not bug. Or, like, you kind of roll with it. Like, I don't know. You have to accept that in your games. Like, there's going to be something you don't intend, and unless it's game breaking, it's usually fine. Team Cherry, who made Hollow Knight, they tried to anticipate, and this actually was a good thing for them to do, to anticipate, like, create a richness with their game. They tried to anticipate ways that the player might sequence break or go around the intended order of some of the, like, items that unlock you in a certain sequence through the environment. But, like, people figured out ways to get around that. They tried to anticipate a few, but then the players found a bunch of others. That's just going to happen when you release your game to, like, hundreds of thousands of people. Okay. Oh no, replace it with Rice Krispie treats. So yeah, you knew someone was going to lose if they mess up their cake and have to replace it with Rice Krispie treats. Yeah, that's like a disaster situation. Watched the first episode of Blown Away. Judges seem to judge more on the technique of what they created than the idea that backed it. Yeah, and with a show like that one in particular, that one's really interesting. Because, so somebody was talking about the show Blown Away, which is the glass blowing show. That one's interesting because it is that art show. And it followed a pattern similar to what I was talking about, where it's like at the beginning, you're probably eliminating the people who have the worst actual use of the thing, right? But then it started like middle end of the season, started getting really murky. Where like the last challenge was literally you have 8 hours, make a gallery show. Fill like you each the two of you have half of this gallery. Fill it with a show, and and they have to form a cohesive narrative. That's it. And like technique gets in. I was saying this to my wife the other day. Like the show, they always fell back on technique, but you could hear the blending of technique and like the creative part go back and forth in their discussion of a piece, to the point where like if anybody's like interested in watching the whole season, I will just say there's a person that stays on longer than they should, who like just at times doesn't even follow the creative brief because their technique is so good. And it's like, how did they escape this one? So yeah, there's this like weird back and forth. And like, again, the same thing will happen in games. Sometimes we used to have this with our global game jam site in a place I used to work, where we'd have like voting for like crowd favorite, and the one that was the most polished would inevitably win. And the tough part about that is that we were trying to like suss out, but they just made kind of a clone of another thing that was just really well constructed. And like technique can get you very far, but you need to, like, that group that would always win the fan favorite based on their technique in the jam, when they would go show their actual game project, because it was like a group of people that like just always wanted to work together because they made games together like in the real world, their games were like actually hugely unique. So it's like when they made a creative product, it's that novelty and that creativity that like took it to the next step of going from just like a thing I made in a jam to, a thing that like a reporter would want to go and talk to them about. Hello. Let's see. Yeah, and yes, somebody said, like, does it change throughout the show? Yeah, it kind of changes. Like I said, it does the arc of, like, weeding out the people that can't do the technique into... And again, like, the challenges in those shows are, like, make a pie, make a cake, make bread, make, I don't know, some blah, blah, blah. I can't remember any of the... Make a vessel. Like, at the beginning of Blown Away, it's like, make a cup, make a vase, make this. At the end, it's like, represent fire. And then everybody has to be like, oh, crap, what are we going to represent fire? So then the challenge becomes, like, more about theme, but the actual, like, method of making is up to them. And then you get like many different things. So, yeah. So yeah, you did a good job capturing that. So that, anyway, so that's design. But like, you can see how those shows embody a certain type of activity that actually tell us a lot about what we do. Where there is these things that we're balancing. It's like, there's the technical aspect of it, but then there's the creative aspect. And it's like, to be good at the technical gets you to a certain distance, but then, the arc of over the course of these shows, but also over the course of like your career and the school experience, but also during your career, is going to make a similar shift where, like, right now, at the beginning you were focused all on technical because you had to learn the techniques. Now you're like making this transition, and the transition is going to keep happening. It's going to get more and more distanced from, being good at Maya is good enough or something like that. You're going to start, what's going to take you to that next level is mastering the creative. Because if you can do that, and you can do these, like I said, some of these things that we talk about that are the real meat of the project, you'll get it. That's like how you kind of lock it in. And that being said, now let's do a brief review of the next project. So you've all had access to this the entire time. I didn't put any time locks on anything. I just made it all available. But so project number 2 for the course is you have to build a game in the GB Studio engine. Okay, there's our technique. All right, you're doing a technical. But the game has to be based on a narrative. And that narrative, I'm going to give you a narrative theme, and I want you to run with it and show me what you've got. Your character in the game is going to the store. So, what does that mean? I mean, literally, give me a video game about your adventure of going to a store. So you're challenged to think about different levels of goals. So long term might be you're going to go buy milk at the store. But what are the short term goals that are going to get you there? Like, you're not going to do well at this if your video game is, okay, get in car, go to store, retrieve milk, come back. That would be, that's not very interesting. You don't want to play that. You probably don't want to make it, right? But like, what if you can't find your keys to get in the car? What if the baby stole the keys and is playing with them? Okay, that's a little more interesting. But then, what if the baby got outside through the open door? Oh my gosh. And then the baby... So you have to go outside now into the backyard and chase the baby into the backyard. But then, the baby goes into the woods. Oh no! They go into a clearing and then are abducted by aliens. You can kind of spiral this and turn it into this adventure story. And the reason that I chose this engine is not because the engine is necessarily of particular importance, but it is a tool that happens to support this type of gameplay. There are already pre-made things, and if you watch the tutorial video that I put out, I go through some of these things, but there's like pre-made stuff in some of the example projects that you can start to work with and mold, that you don't have to build from scratch. And it's a tool that happens to be made for this, like, it's catered to this type of gameplay. You can do other stuff with it, and it has more modes, but, its original form, like what it was started as, was as a thing to make kind of like fetch quest RPG towns. And so those are, I think, the most polished features of it. So that's what your goal is you're trying to make a narrative game based on this simple theme of going to the store. I want you to think about what is the long term versus the short term. So it's like, I'm trying to get milk, but here's all the things standing in the way of me getting to the store, milk, whatever. And ultimately what you're going to be thinking about is the pacing and layout of puzzles, little challenges, like, I want you to make a nice little level with good pacing. It's not like, oh, I need 4 puzzles, I have 4 rooms. I want you to like kind of think about, how you encounter these things, how the distance walk to each place affects the pacing of your game. Is it a slow game? Is it a fast game? That's up to you to answer. Do you want a slow game or a fast game? Do you want it to be kind of like zany and manic, like the sudden alien abduction thing I described, or do you want it to be kind of slow and thoughtful? That's up to you. It's like based on what your story's about and what the tone of your story is. Does the play, is it linear? Do you backtrack? Those are things to think about. because backtracking can be cool. Maybe visiting the same place multiple times in a game makes you familiar with the place and get to know its people. Or maybe like it's just annoying because you have to backtrack so often. You know, it's up to you to pull that kind of stuff off. So again, you're writing a story. Is it painful to be out? Do you make like a really, you know, slice of modern life thing where like going to the store is kind of a stressful experience? Or do you make, again, like some other type of story? Is there anything that needs to be assumed, such as setting? So a store refers to modern day stores. That's up to you. If you want to, I mean, I could even say like it could be an errand. I just need you to go retrieve like have a long-term goal, and that goal might be an errand. But no, I like this line of questioning. So the idea is that like maybe it doesn't need to be modern day. It doesn't have to be set now. So you could come up with something. That's not to say everybody say, oh, okay, got it. Like automatically going to do fantasy or sci-fi. You know, try not to go down those holes. Hopefully, like this gives you some. Actually, you know, I'm just gonna say no fantasy or sci-fi. Try not to do a stereotypical game setting. Like, if you were to do a Western, like, that's not stereotypical. I think Westerns are still kind of fresh enough, even though there have been some great game Westerns. But, yeah, try not to do... I would say, like, yeah, let's keep it away from, you know, a stereotype game setting. That would be the only thing that I would say don't do. You know... If it's been the setting for at least like 5 AAA games, you can rattle off real quick. Maybe. So, what are you doing? Like, this is about interactive narrative. And this is about how, like, there's going to be different types of narrative in your games. There's going to be narrative that is baked into your game, which is like, I am telling... Our game is a story about Jane. Jane does this. Jane is a space marine. Jane fights the Garblefargs. Post-apocalyptic. No post-apocalyptic. Don't do post-apocalyptic. Again, that one is well trod. So, yeah, try to stay away from the post-apocalyptic stuff. Yeah. Good question though. Again, like try to stay away from like the game stereotypes, if you can. You know. So, and again, like I want you to think in broad terms about like what this game could be. So yeah, you're exploring like different types of narrative in games. There's going to be a story you're telling, but then there's also going to be like open-endedness such that players can probably, like by virtue of being different people who interact with your one game object, they will create their own narrative. That's not something you necessarily need to program in heavily. That's just the fact of playing games. But you can understand that and welcome it through your design. Express emotions or ideas through game mechanics. Learn how to build games with strong limitations. So this is the other thing. So why am I doing this? Why did I talk about or use this engine? Well, the engine, like I said, I'm not rating you based on the engine because this is not an engine that you're going to like put on a resume and go get a job in necessarily. One could argue that, you know, even popular engines are a little dicey in that area because, like, if you were to go work at a game studio, they're probably rolling their own engine as opposed to, like, using Unity or Unreal. But, so why do we use this engine? Well, again, it's about, one, so I'm modeling a few things for you. One is that when you are picking, and I'm actually going through this with some of the capstone students right now. So they're switching over from the research part of the semester to the production part of the semester. The research part of the semester is heavily based on, like, I tell them, like, don't tell me what you're making it in. Research your idea, your topic. Set up the mental, set up your idea really well so that you can understand what it is you are ultimately trying to achieve creatively. Well, now they're switching to the actual making, so I'm getting, it's like, so should I use 3D or 2D? And they're hung up, it's like, I know you want to open that software and start it off, but like, storyboard your animation. Just lay the animation out and then look at the scope of it and then say, it would be faster to do this versus that, or something like that. So what the lesson here should be, and again, like, think of this as a late challenge in one of these shows, like the Blown Away show. The beginning challenges are always make a cake, make a vase. And they want to see your technique at those things. But by the end of the show, they're like, make a work of art that expresses the idea of fire. And it's like really abstract and subjective. And it's your job as the creator to say, yes, well, the best game engine that has the best features for expressing the philosophical idea of fire is Scratch. So, and like, that's not, why am I choosing the engine for you? It's to model that. So, I'm giving you a narrative. Basically, I'm also, helping you understand, like, what elements of an engine will help you make a choice like that. I'm not making you make that choice yet, because you're not quite at the point where you need to be making that choice. You can if you want, but there's another element to it. So I'm trying to model this idea of, like, I'm giving you this creative idea, and what you should be looking for in an engine is not necessarily like, what is the most graphically impressive? What is this? What is that? It's what's going to help me make my creative idea. And so, like, this engine already has some elements kind of baked into it, like I said, that'll kind of, you'll have to work less hard to make it, if that makes sense. So if you look at the tutorial that I show you, I don't literally have the character in the tutorial going to a store, but I do have a quest, like a nested quest-based structure where you have to go ultimately get into a cave, and a guy says, go do 3 nice things for people in town. And then you have to, like, go explore the town and talk to the people, and then the people say, I can't find my cat, or my brother's playing hide and seek and I'm too lazy to find him. And there's even one where it's like, look at 3 cool rocks, but one of the cool rocks is behind the person that can't find his cat, so you have to find the cat to finish the other. You could do these sort of nested quests in there too. And that's all in the tutorial that I did. But, like, that's, a checkbox request, people to talk to, rocks to push, little things like that. Dialogue, that's kind of easy in there. So that's the lesson 1 is focus on the idea. Like, yes, you have to do the technical, but the idea of this engine is that it should make your life a little easier. Because it supports this kind of gameplay really easily. So know that and kind of understand, like, hey, that's how you should think about these from now on when you are given open choice. Idea first, then technical implementation. But the second one is that the reason I chose this engine, and I'm probably not going to be as amenable to alternatives as I am in usual projects. Like, I've had for the Twine project in the past, people say, well, can we use RenPy because we want to do a visual novel style? And I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever. You're still doing a story. Here I want you to do specific engine. And here's why. Another soft lesson of this, it's going to actually be a tough lesson, is that GB Studio is an engine specifically made to make games for Game Boy. I forgot to bring my Game Boy to be all like, Game Boy. But imagine I have a Game Boy. Like the black and white one from 1989. Now, what does that mean? Well, you can only use 4 colors, technically 5, but like characters and environment objects can really only have 4 colors. One of them is for characters, one of them is the transparent color. So yeah, like the whole palette has 5 colors. On characters, it's 3 colors and transparency. On environment objects, it's 4 colors, no transparency. And so like each palette for each like environments or characters has 1 that you can't use out of the 5. So there's that. The other thing with it, so you've got to deal with an incredible, like how are you going to make art with an incredibly limited color palette? 2 is that on a screen, or well, in a scene, so in like, a chunk of game that is loaded at a time, you can only have like 192 unique environment tiles, which seems like a lot, but can actually go pretty quickly. So you can't do like the fine detailing you can do if you're trying to do this like expansive 3D environment that you have no limits on, right? You have to like kind of keep it tight. So, this is why on Game Boy games, like you'll see kind of lots of borders with lots of forest or lots of houses with very similar elements because, you're trying to keep that tile set down. I don't struggle with that as much, but, you might run into it if you try to over detail things. 3 is that in each scene, in each chunk of level that's loaded, you can only have 30 game objects at a time, which isn't so bad depending on how much is going on in your scene. And, you don't need 30 for good gameplay. But if we rewind it a little bit, a caveat of this, though, is that only 10 game objects may be on the screen at a time. Those game objects would include things like your user interface, or items, or enemies, or, so now you're starting to like whittle it down into like, oh shoot, okay, that's starting to get limiting, is like, I can only have 10 things on a screen. Now, also because it's Game Boy, the screen is like 160 by 144. Haha. And then, so if any of you are not sweating yet, here's the kicker. A whole scene, if the scene is a screen size or multiple screen sizes, can have no more than 25 frames of animation total. Now, if you go to a new scene, it ticks over, but every scene can only have 25 frames of animation. That is the kicker. And that's tough because you have to deal with, that's why you're going to have, if you want to go all out on animation and have tons of anticipation and follow through and all that other stuff, you can't do it. Or that has to be the only thing in the scene. That's why you have like a lot of boop, boop, little pixel characters with 2-frame walks. So why am I doing this to you? I'm not trying to torture you. What I'm trying to do is get you to understand how to work within limitations. Because here's the thing. If I just said, make me a game, tell a story, you'd get bogged down by imagining, like, trying to navigate this vast blue sky. In fact, that's why you might hear the phrase blue sky in design. That means, like, no boundaries. The problem with blue sky is that if you're not given any limitations whatsoever, it can be very easy to get lost in trying to do everything and anything. So that's why we research in game design. So like, again, eventually, with your, and this is where the mastery towards the end of those shows comes from. When you get to something like Capstone, I'm gonna give you blue sky. I'm gonna say, hey, make a game, make an animation, or make a piece of art, whatever. It's your job to build yourself a box to live in. And what that box does is it gives you boundaries to, say my game is going to have this art style, and it's going to have this core mechanic or this gameplay. That is your box. And the tough part about your Unities and your Unreals is that there's no box. When you watch the Unreal 5 revealed demo and they're like, you can shove in ZBrush models, like, there are people that are like, the sky's the limit, and there are people that are like sweating in former mobile developer, because this is having no limits is what happens when I receive projects from people and there's like, here's my one level and it's 20 gigabytes. That's the problem with Blue Sky, is that you end up shooting yourself in the foot because you bog down the computer or you run out of ideas to have because you don't know where to start with your idea. This is your time to learn to work inside of a box. So the box is very tiny because it's a Game Boy cartridge. You don't literally have to put it on a Game Boy cartridge. That involves like specialized equipment. But, you're making a Game Boy ROM. You'll be able to launch it as a ROM that you can load onto an emulator. But it's going to be very tiny. And that's important because it's like, well, it's up to you. So yeah, somebody says, people always say restrictions actually encourage imagination. That's really the point I'm kind of rambling on about a little bit, is that restrictions encourage imagination. So I'm giving you like really strict technical restrictions because I want to see it squeeze that creativity out of you. So, how do you get around lack of ability to have like tons of frames for animation? Make really easily readable, expressive sprites. How do you, design around limitation? Like, you'll have to design around limitations of character amount on screen, how much stuff you can fit on screen. You're going to be wrestling with this stuff, but man, it'll probably end up making you make some like great levels or really good story or, something like that. You'll be able to make some really awesome stuff because you have to kind of like cut off all the fat of your game and you just got to like get to the core of it. If you've ever played Zelda Link's Awakening on Game Boy or on the Switch, that world is huge and it's full of stuff, but it's really lean. Like, there is something on every screen that is interesting, and that is awesome. So that's what I'm trying to get you to do, is like, you're going to be put under these tight restrictions, but those restrictions are hopefully going to squeeze out, like, you have no choice but to be massively creative within these restrictions. And again, the reason I do this is not to torture you, but to give you, the restrictions will ultimately give you like a creative box to live in, and that box, understanding how to do that, eventually you'll learn how to essentially build your own box, and that building your own box is what makes you the person that gets to those final challenges, So game requirements: 1 player, trip to the store to run an errand. Like somebody said, remember, I'm acknowledging you. I'm not going to say your name on live stream for privacy reasons. But like somebody said, does it have to be a literal store? You can tweak it. I mean, keep that idea to run an errand, but yeah, it doesn't need to be like you need to go to the Acme or the Giant Eagle. You could fudge it. Just don't be like, what if the zombie Giant Eagle? No. What if the post-apocalyptic in space Giant Eagle? No. Try to stay away from, let's stay away from like cliches. You can take the role of at least one character. Maybe there's multiple characters. You must have at least 4 quests to fulfill throughout the game. And a good way to think about them is like maybe there's a big arching quest. So, ultimate goal, that is quest 1, like get to the store. To get the can of beans. That is a quest. And then if there's like 3 other quests that lead up to get the can of beans, those are 4 quests. But you're thinking about different like nested goals and short-term, long-term. Structure them short-term, long-term, hierarchy. You should build at least 7 scenes. And if you see, the layout of a project in GB Studio, each little room or whatever you want to call it is a scene. 3-minute, we'll do live stream on Teams like we did last week. You'll be evaluated on goals are structured in an interesting way. Do you have a good game? Like, is it an interesting experience? You have a meaningful and interesting narrative. So, like I said, make sure it's something more than just I got in the car and went to the store, and then try to like present it well. And then I am sharing a few games on here. So there's some good twines, actually. We're not doing twine, but like there's some good twines with really interesting story structures that I think you should look at. And then there's a bunch of GB Studio games that actually are, really nice. That could be good examples for you. And then the other thing is, and they give you like different settings and topics. Like there is one that's like a horror story. If you wanted to do a horror, like that maybe that's the one exception to the cliche. Like I love a good horror game, and you can do horror anywhere. So I feel like horror is a little more malleable than like, again, sci-fi, fantasy, post-apocalyptic. And then there's 2 readings. Game Design is Narrative Architecture by Henry Jenkins, which is a really great paper on like narrative, how space makes narrative in games, which I think would be really handy for this type of thing. And then the metrics of space molecule design. So it's like how to connect spaces to one another in interesting ways in games, which I think could really help. So any questions on this in particular, on this project? Cold coffee. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the questions come in. Please ask them if you have them. But I'm going to start on this. I realize we don't have a whole lot of time, but this is a pretty short lecture. This is ultimately a project about narrative. And when you make stories with games, we've talked about this, which is, mechanics versus motif. Now, as we've talked about, this is not a purely bipolar thing. There's lots of other things that go into games, like the technology or your theme or your mission or your uniqueness or, things like that. But, a good thing when you are thinking about, like as a beginner, if you think about these 2 aspects of games. Hi person, first time on, welcome. So this is a lecture for a course that I teach on game design, but I do welcome people to come and sit in. So we just finished talking. I'm talking to my students about, game design in general and creativity and, a specific assignment that they have. So you obviously don't need to do the assignment. But, right now we are talking about aspects of interactive narrative. So this is patterned for, young game designers, first time game designers. I hope you find it interesting. But I will say, if you are like a person who's done tons and tons of narrative for games. You might find some of this 101. That's okay, though, because it's for an audience who is learning. So, so we often talk about this in a kind of bipolar way, and I don't think that's always great. But we have spent a lot of time talking about mechanics, so we're gonna switch gears and talk about those motif elements. And one thing that I want you to be aware of, we're not going to dive into it because this is not a class on the history of game academia or on the history of game studies. But one thing I want you to be aware of, at least, is this idea that there are people who see games as either a storytelling medium or a narrative medium. And that's not as much today as it was like maybe 10, 15 years ago. But there is this aspect of understanding games where people consider them kind of one or the other. If you look deeper into this particular topic, and that's something that I think we cover a little bit in the gaming and culture class when we talk about game studies, but they talk a lot about, there are other aspects to this, like, some of this was also coded gendered language, which is not great. By not great, I mean terrible. But, understand that, like, there is this sort of split, right? And I'm not a believer in the split. One, again, the split is very old, so I don't think people really function under it anymore. And if they do, they're usually not. They're kind of jerks about it. But, we have this idea of, like, interactive narrative. Like, we've come out with this idea. We've come out with, like, lots of ideas about narratives, place in games, and theming in games. Like, this is like one of the things that might have even been said to come out of this is like the idea of serious games, where you do make a game that's so richly about ideas that it becomes an expressive medium for expressing the ideas. But we also have this idea that's more part of what we're doing today, which is interactive narrative, which is a form of procedural, meaning like made of rules, experience where players create or influence a dynamic story through their actions. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's useful to break narrative in games into, you can break it into lots of pieces, but we're going to focus on two. And one of them is embedded narrative, story elements that are authored into an interactive experience that cannot be changed. So what does that mean? Well, that means in your game, you tell a story. So that's things like a cutscene in a game. Now, if you've ever played Half-Life 2, this is an interesting example because, this is the start of that type of storytelling in games where, you walk into a space and characters are talking and acting out a scene in front of you as though you're in a stage play. And then you can either kind of like become part of the play and follow them around and listen, or you can just like wander off and like smash stuff until the scene's over. So there's, things like this that are kind of in between, but then there's also like full openness, which means like just pure gameplay. And then there's things like, put down the controller, grab the popcorn kind of cutscenes. So, I'm playing a Japanese role play. I'm playing Final Fantasy VII, and now it is time to watch Aerith die. That's not a spoiler. Everybody knows that. But, that is a, like, cutscene. So, but we're also looking at, how can we mix these two things? So it's also important to understand this idea of emergent narrative. Now, what's that? So that is story elements created through a player's interaction with a game system. Now, what does that mean? Is this actually going to play a video? Maybe not. No. Okay. Well, anyway, so I think the video... Oh, it will play a little bit of video. So I'm going to turn off the sound. But like, I usually don't like to stream other people's stuff on this channel, so I'm not. This isn't even really working that well, so I'm just gonna click through some stuff. I'm going to click to the next slide. Nope. There we go. And then I'm actually going to show a picture of this game. So, interactive narrative is a particular type of game, and there are levels of this, where you can, most games have two phases. There's like the story part and the game part. But in reality, you can go much deeper, and there's like a lot of people that really experiment with this, of mixing and matching these different types like of narrative events. So, if anybody recognizes this game, it's called Facade, and it's actually a experimental project in AI and interactive narrative from faculty members and students at UC Santa Cruz. This is kind of old at this point, but it became a meme a number of years ago because like you could just do stuff to this couple. Like the idea of the game is that you are a guest at this couple's dinner party and they are in the middle of a fight. And then the AIs are such that like when you do stuff, they react in different ways. And because of the nature of this game, it's actually very open-ended and you can screw with the game itself. And that made it a meme, but it's interesting that a game like that can become a meme in the first place. That it's reactive enough that like, you can get these funny and unintended experimental outcomes. And I've talked previously about colleagues of mine who graduated from that program who did similar things where they created storytelling systems that did these sorts of like, generative, never the same way twice stories. I'm probably butchering the description of it, but the idea is like, what if instead of a physics system, the game had a system for generating social interaction? And that's where these things start to blend and get really muddy, where like the gameplay is the narrative. There's no like, and now she is going to throw a glass of wine in his face. A bottle of wine, that would hurt. A glass of wine in his face because he was a jerk. That doesn't always happen. Another similar thing could actually be found in board games where, if you've ever played the Dune, Dune board game, based on the novel and upcoming this year movie, or what's the other board game? Oh, if you've ever played a game like Diplomacy that actually simulates like a period of history, right? When you play Diplomacy, which is like pre-World War I Europe, at no point do you stop the game and say, hey, everybody, it's 1914, we got to assassinate Franz Ferdinand and start World War I. You could start World War I in 1901 if you want to. You just be like, you know what, let's cut the crap. Everybody, screw you. It's World War I, baby. If you want to, because the game doesn't create the narrative of history, it gives you the pieces of history to play with to make your own outcomes. Same thing with Dune. The good guys from the book and the bad guys from the book can team up. Because you're playing with the systems of Dune, you're not being like, okay, gotta stop and kill the character. I'm not gonna reveal anything because now it actually matters. If you were wanted to see that movie, so that's an important distinction. Playing with the system of the story instead of watching the story. So interactive narrative has, you're dealing with a few different things. You're dealing with this thing called a possibility space of how emergent is it? How much possibility does your game allow? When you play Grand Theft Auto, yeah, there's a story, but you can, by virtue of just like how much stuff is in Grand Theft Auto, and how many abilities you have, you could just like go do a ton of things. Grand Theft Auto 4, you could not be a criminal ever in it. You could just like go bowling and date people in Grand Theft Auto 4. And there are people who, as like a sort of piece of performance art, play games like that with the goal of like never doing the crime part because you can. But then there's also this idea of sort of on the opposite, which is the illusion of choice, which is like, how do you, if you are making a linear thing, give people the impression that they actually have lots of space to do stuff. And, part of this is that, it's not that games only have this like written narrative. Games also have things that contribute to the awareness of that narrative. If you have like rooms and hallways, your game's going to feel linear and its story's going to feel linear. So here we have maps from 2 Final Fantasy games, one 7 and one 13. And actually, I guess you could leverage a similar criticism to Final Fantasy VII Remake, although it doesn't feel quite as hallway room as 13 does. But like both games, original 7 and 13, are linear stories. A always happens before B. You always take down the reactor and then go to the bar and then go take down the other reactor and then leave, go to the Shinra building and bam, 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 bam. You never not do that in order. But Final Fantasy VII feels open because even though the game kind of like controls how much of the world you have access to at any given time based on like what abilities it gives you, you still get to like wander around a bit. And that gives you the impression of freedom, even when you don't have freedom. Versus, again, games that like give you a lot of freedom to do stuff. So sometimes the illusion of choice is just based on like how many branches you offer to the player. Like you hear, this used to be kind of like, ooh, wow, oh my gosh, alternate endings. But now if you were to make a Star Wars game and like light side, dark side ending, people would be like, oh, okay, I guess. But now if you have like if you have something more like this, and even though there's like still ultimately linearity, you still feel like you can do more when you have like multiple branches that you can explore. So, and this is where like conversation systems, like in Mass Effect, which is getting a re-release soon, which is exciting, come in because even if the system boils down to being linear, you still get this impression of non-linearity, or at least an impression of more content. Sometimes it literally is more content. Sometimes it's not that much more content, but it feels like more. And, it's important to know how to do that because even if you are making a linear game, because maybe you're a small team with only a few weeks and a limited budget or no budget, you can still kind of like give the perception of freedom, and that can actually matter a lot. So it's important to know how actual huge possibility space, fully emergent narrative is built, and then understand like how one can work backward from there. Or again, there are people who pursue that perfect like all-encompassing narrative as a goal, and like have done their PhDs on it. So but these are things that you can do with storytelling in games. It doesn't just have to be point A to point B to point C. So then again, we can start to talk about like narrative management in our games. Like, how does your game narrative respond to the system running in the background? We're only a few slides away from the end, so don't worry, we're almost there. So consider, for example, the game Depression Quest, which is a Twine game where you are a person with depression, and the game is about what it's like living with depression. So, there is a defined, because it's a Twine, there is a predefined number of branching dialogue options in this game. However, the game gives you a lot of sort of like emergent moments by forcing you to think about, the person in this situation. So, it, because of like what you've done in the games and the actions you've taken, there may be these like strike through options that you cannot click on that are like part of the adventure. And if you don't have access to them, it creates, like, even within you, the player, this own extra meta narrative where you're starting to think about the story of playing the game. And you're like, I really wanted, I know for myself, it's like I was rooting for this person to be able to make this healthy choice, but it just could not happen because of the narrative in the game and the choices that I had made. And that creates like emotion and meaning and interest. So you have like, there is embedded narrative, which is the story, the literal written story elements of the game. There's the emergent narrative of, I chose this choice early, and that set off a variable that then kept me away from this choice later, and that created an emergent outcome of my interacting with the game system. And that now there is the story that I can tell you about, like, my thought process as I was playing this game and thinking about this person and wondering about this person and worrying about this person. So, you can nest all these different types of narrative on top of each other, and that is how games become memorable and meaningful. Again, like, you also have these fully organic systems like your prom weeks, where the game does actually feature like a lot of, this is a full narrative management system that does random outcomes. And that creates like potentially thousands and hundreds of thousands of potential story events. But that is like the furthest extent, you're not going to build this before the end of the project or with GB Studio. That would be impressive. It would probably make the Game Boy start billowing smoke. But, like, again, these are things that people do with games, is they build these, like, AI narrative systems. And, that can even manages to give you almost perfect emergence. So tips for dealing with this: think about what your verbs of your story are to get you started. And how can your writing direct or influence player activity? So like when you think about the verbs of your story, think about like what is your story about, but also how the verbs of your story can both create narrative events, whether they be like the gameplay narrative events of like, playing a Halo game. I keep going back to playing any shooter is interesting because you have a certain level of narrative abilities, and they are tuned to either create like harrowing experiences that you're like, oh my god, I can't believe I got past that, or they're meant to create like your sort of stories of, oh my gosh, did you see that awesome move I pulled off on this bad guy? And the verbs and the mechanics and the elements of your game create opportunity for those emergent narratives to come out and for the, like, to create those emotional experiences that turn into stories. How can your writing direct or influence player activity? When you have that possibility of emergence, how does your story kind of like nudge them towards an emotional context? Think about that. and maybe like how does the narrative and the tuning of the game come together to create an experience? The Dark Souls Doom dichotomy. It's like Doom. It's not just that you are strong in the context of the game. You're also Doom Guy, and Doom Guy is awesome, and Doom Guy, everybody's afraid of him. And that's a little bit of the story. What storytelling elements can be turned into variables? Again, you're making that with your game right now that you're starting. You're going to make quests. Those quests are going to be variables. Like, have you seen my cat? Cat seen. Variable, seen cat. True or false. You can turn those into story events into variables. And then how do variables affect narrative events? Well, okay. If seen cat equals false, be like, I sent you to find my cat 7 hours ago. What's going on? You start to say like, well, if this hasn't happened yet, maybe we have this reaction versus that reaction, or this dialogue versus that dialogue, and then you start building up like little bits of narrative, and it becomes, again, you create this like richer story than the game itself, which can be exciting. So that's it. Thank you for staying a few extra minutes. Because we're so over time, but we got it all in. Yes. I will be happy to take questions in the Discord. So please reach out in Discord, and I will talk to you later. Bye.